So hello and welcome to another episode of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. I was reading an article the other day and the title was this: People are realizing that the arsenal of democracy is gone. It's possible to bring it back, but it's going to be very difficult. What they're really talking about is since World War II, America has really been funding all of the defense of the Western nations in large measure. And now it's not clear that they can continue to produce at the same level or that there's the political will. So we wanted to update two stories today for you, really what is going on in Ukraine. Things are kind of stalled as our attention spans go to the Middle East, and then go and take a look at the really shocking remarks from the head of the Navy in Canada on the critical state of the Canadian military. So we'll do that with Admiral Norman in just a few moments. But first, as always on this issue, we go to Marcus Kolga. He's a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's also the founder of disinfowatch.org, which is when we talk about Mr. Putin, we talk about disinformation. Marcus, good to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on, Senator.
It's just great. So I read The Economist this week, question mark, is Putin winning? Then the head of NATO comes out and says, get ready, be prepared for some bad news. Where are we on the Ukraine-Russia front?
Well, preparing ourselves for bad news out of this conflict. I mean, it's only been bad news over the past 2 years, and really going back to 2014 when this conflict really began, when Russia, of course, invaded and occupied Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine. Your point about the Economist headline, the question is Putin winning? Well, I'm not sure that he's winning, but he's not yet really losing either. Right. I think there were expectations, sky high expectations in the spring and summer that the Ukrainian counteroffensive would rip through those Russian lines, retake potentially Crimea and other large swaths of land, and that hasn't happened. I don't think that the Ukrainian army and the Western world were prepared for how well prepared Russia and Vladimir Putin were for this counteroffensive. The defensive lines that those Ukrainian forces encountered, these dragon teeth, they're large concrete pyramids that were laid by the Russian army for thousands of kilometers along the front lines. The intensity of the mining activities. According to reports, there were 5 to 6 landmines every square meter along the front lines. No one was prepared for that. I mean, they were stacked up. Yeah. And so, this slowed down those advances. But at the same time, I think it's important for us to pay attention to the successes that Ukraine has had, and they have had a number of them over the past 6 months. One is the recapturing and securing of the entire Western Black Sea. They have forced the Russian Navy to basically retreat from Crimea and restation all of their ships in on the eastern coast of the Black Sea. That is a major success because that's going to allow the delivery of grain to vulnerable nations in North Africa and parts of the global south, the ones that are desperately in need of that Ukrainian grain. Second is that breakthrough in the south. We've seen it over the past 4 weeks. Ukrainian forces have broken through on the Dnieper River in the south. And if they can maintain those breakthroughs, if they can establish permanent bridgeheads there, that will allow them to move heavy equipment. And if you combine that with the F-16s that the Dutch government and the Danes and the Swedes have committed and will be delivering in the new year, I think we're going to see a bit of a change in that environment and a good opportunity for the Ukrainians to make some of those major gains going into the latter part of the winter and in the spring. So things are dire, but I still have a hope and optimism that Ukraine will be able to push back Russia in the coming months.
I mean, Putin's biggest asset really and is complacency in our short attention span. Everything's moved over to the focus on the Middle East, and And I think it's very difficult. I know Zelensky was supposed to be having a private briefing with US senators because of the uncertainty around all the funding and what will happen with that. That was kind of called off at the last moment. But he must be feeling the cold at this point from the cold shoulder from the US and the discussions about, well, there has to be some kind of deal here. We just can't go on forever and we don't have, the arms needed. And Russia just, I mean, it's got all the time in the world. As you talk about his approach, he doesn't care how many of his own soldiers he kills. That's just fodder. So he can do whatever he wants. He can wait everybody out.
Right, and that's exactly his strategy here. Vladimir Putin he wants to stall this war. He wants there to be a freeze in the conflict to allow himself and his armed forces to reconstitute themselves, to rearm themselves. And let's be honest, what he's really waiting for is November 2024. He's banking on a second Trump presidency. A second Trump presidency would probably assure him of at least holding on to the territory that he's stolen over the past number of years, certainly over the past 2 years. But it may open the door to a crumbling of the unity within NATO. And if that were to happen, we're in real trouble. It's the kind of trouble that we haven't seen since the Second World War, because Vladimir Putin will, whether Trump wins or doesn't, it's entirely likely that he will try again to take Kiev, but it's possible that he will try somewhere else along his border with Eastern Europe. That could be the Baltics. It could even be Finland. We've already seen.
Yeah, you're watching Finland. They've closed their border.
Exactly, because what Vladimir Putin has been doing, as Lukashenko did about a year and a half ago against Latvia and Lithuania, he's weaponizing migrants. He's bringing in migrants and forcing them across the border in efforts to try and destabilize Finnish democracy, to cause divisions in Finland. So he's already trying there. And I think Canadians need to remember we share a very long border with Russia in our Arctic.
Yes,
and Vladimir Putin has spent the past 20 years militarizing the entire Arctic. He has put out official government documents stating that there will be a conflict in the Arctic. It's not going to be Canada. It's probably not going to be Greenland, Denmark, or the US that are going to start that conflict. It's going to either be Russia or China. And so we're not prepared for that eventuality, but Vladimir Putin certainly is preparing his army for that conflict.
The other news that I find really troubling is that despite the sanctions, we didn't really do a great job of enforcing them. We talked a good game, but we did not much. He controls minerals, metals, oil worth $75 trillion. They had a good wheat crop this year, so he's got exports. Like, there's no shortage of money here for him to keep this going in this waiting game.
Well, your point about sanctions is spot on, and I thank you for bringing this up. This is an area that I've been working in for the past decade, and I'm really concerned too that we've just basically, our sanctions are worth about as much as the paper that they're written on. If we're not enforcing them, if we're not implementing them, then what's the point? And that's what we're seeing right now. There was a report that was put out about 3 weeks ago by my friend Gary Kasparov at the World Liberty Forum.
The famous chess player who has become
very probably, the Wayne Gretzky of the chess world, essentially.
Yes, exactly.
And more importantly, today he's one of the most vocal opponents to Vladimir Putin. He put out a report with the World Liberty Congress, I should say, about 3 weeks ago, and I was in Vilnius with him. That revealed that Canadian hardware was being exported to Central Asia and likely on to Russia. These were triggering devices for landmines. We're talking about over 100,000 of them. And somehow, whoever the exporter was in Canada was able to export them to Central Asia, and this same company, which hadn't exported much to Russia, suddenly a few months later was exporting these sorts of devices to Russia. And so,
It's
we need to.
outrageous.
Well, we need what we need to do is we need to dedicate resources and commit ourselves to enforcing these sanctions. Because if we don't do that, we're basically allowing Vladimir Putin to get away with it. And of course, those sanctions were intended to place pressure on the oligarchs that surround him. If they're able to do as they please, conduct business with the West as if things were normal, that's not very helpful. And so, yeah, we need to do a heck of a lot more to make sure that those sanctions do bite as they should.
Do you have any, or what is your level, I guess I'll put it that way, of concern about the U.S. commitment at this point? I mean, they really are stretched in terms of what they're shipping overseas, not to mention they're pulling down their oil reserves and all of that as well. But that they've got a kind of a crumbling manufacturing base too, and China's just outbuilding them on artillery and ships and anything else you can name.
Yeah, I mean, they've been extremely slow to respond to the geopolitical situation. You're right. Their ability to produce more weapons. I mean, it's they've had their hands tied for quite some time. I would argue that Canada has as well, even though we do have manufacturers of ammunition and weapons, hardware that could be used by our own military, of course, but also by Ukraine. And so I'm a bit flabbergasted as to why we're not working with those corporations to ramp up our production right here in this country of, whether it's 155 millimeter artillery shells, armored personnel vehicles, other weapons as well. We need to be doing that just as the U.S. But you asked whether I'm concerned. I'm concerned about what's happening right now in the Senate in the U.S. I want to believe that this is a minority within that GOP caucus. I want to believe that Senator McConnell, others like Lindsey Graham, who are supporters of Ukraine, that they will prevail over this vocal isolationist minority. But I think that Canada and our allies, we need to be prepared for the fact that, that vocal minority may be the ones that prevail in this argument. And we also need to anticipate a Trump presidency. This is something that is entirely realistic. And I don't think that we're prepared for it. And I don't think that we are preparing for that eventuality either.
And Russia has been regularly testing our resolve, and we've let them get away with it. And I think, as you once quite brilliantly just said, Putin is ideologically agnostic. This is simply about power, and he has a very long time span. He's protected.
You're absolutely right. He is. He has no ideology. His only ideology is to stay in power for as long as possible and steal as much as he can from the Russian people and any of the countries that he occupies. And so if you're working with someone like that, the only way to push back against him is through force. And we haven't done enough. I mean, we should have been sending the level of weapons that we're sending to Ukraine right now. We should have been sending to them 2 years ago. Had we done that, we wouldn't be in this problem. But and now we need to
him now running around. He's going to international meetings. I mean, there was a while there he was afraid to leave the country. Not so much anymore.
Well, that's right. I mean, he just today, as we're speaking, he's in the UAE. Not all that remarkably, UAE is also helping export dual use technologies to Russia to support its war in Ukraine. So that's not surprising. And he's gathering these other authoritarian countries around him to support his cause as well, because his survival is also in their interests, and his fight against democracy is also in their interests.
Marcus Kolga with the Macdonald Laurier Institute, also the founder of disinfowatch.org. Thank you so much for your insight on this as we all head into yet another long winter and not a great Christmas for the Ukrainians.
No, not at all. Thanks as always, Senator, for having me on and for keeping this issue on the national radar. Thank you.
So, as we've just been discussing with Marcus, the American view on Ukraine, how long will their political will and their ability or willingness to support this war continue when they're focused on the Middle East? All of this whole issue of the arsenal of democracy funded by the US is critical to Canada as well. And we saw some astounding statements this week from the head of the Canadian Navy about our lack of readiness and our lack of equipment. Mark Norman, senior defense strategist at Samuel Associates. He was, of course, a vice admiral in the Royal Canadian Navy, in the Navy for 40 years, and he was also the vice chief of the Defense Staff of Canada. Admiral Norman, thank you very much for being with us. This whole question, just before we get into our Navy in particular, but your assessment of whether or not the arsenal of democracy is one that can still be counted on.
Yeah, well, thanks, Senator, for having me once again, and thank you and your team for your ongoing interest in these really important issues. It's an interesting turn of phrase.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard it. I like it, but I also am. I share the concern of your previous guest. And this is the thing. We look at it through the lens of not just Ukraine, but what's going on with China and their continued aggression. Ultimately, we and this is the narrative that gets lost in our day-to-day and busy lives. The quality of life that we have enjoyed for our entire lives and that we continue to enjoy in the West is the result of a bunch of things. But in the context of our discussion today, this is really about decades, if not coming up on almost a century, of a global system based on the cooperation of democracies, the economic integration of those democracies, shared responsibilities with respect to collective defense through a variety of different, frameworks, and ultimately, a community of shared interests and shared values. And what we're seeing is fissures, fractures. We're seeing the erosion of some of these frameworks that have proven the test of time, and we're starting to see them being threatened. And back to the Ukraine question specifically. So I am becoming increasingly concerned about the patience of the West and whether they have the stomach to sustain the level of support that the Ukrainian people require. I am increasingly concerned about, and have been for a long time. Russia got its nose bloodied early in this conflict, but ultimately they're in this for the long fight, and they know how to do a long fight. And I don't think we're paying enough attention to the deeper issues here. And of course, as you and I have discussed previously, we have China out there basically exploiting the situation in the context of their own strategic interests, and this is a growing concern. And so we all look to the U.S. The U.S. is burning a lot of cash, as are a lot of the Western economies, but the impact on the rest of us is that, we've all depended on them. I'm not sure how sustainable their own defense capabilities are, right? So that's a long answer to a really important question.
Because, you hear this from Republican congressmen, senators. The Americans are trillions of dollars in debt, and in order to continue to fund these foreign wars, they need to borrow from China, and they're posing that question. And I in this article about the arsenal of democracy, it says U.S. efforts can only produce 1/9 of the artillery shells that they could in 1995. China can produce 200 times as many ships as the U.S. These are staggering numbers.
Yeah, and this comes down to, issues of industrial capacity. It comes down
Right.
to issues of um, impacts of decisions that have been made over the decades.
Yeah.
We didn't get into this situation by accident, but we didn't necessarily know what the impacts were going to be of the decisions that have been made over the preceding decades. And that's a great segue right into
Yeah.
the reference that you made to Admiral Topshee and the challenges that he's trying to manage on behalf of the Canadian people with respect to the Royal Canadian Navy.
I mean, this is you, this is your world for 40 years. The Canadian Navy, when he says we can't be ready, we don't have a state of readiness, we don't have enough ships, we sometimes have the wrong ships in the wrong places. I mean, this is for a country that is surrounded on three sides by water from sea to sea to sea. It's shocking.
It is. And, I have a few reactions. First of all, on a personal level, I, uh, I feel terrible, and I know my colleagues, other former heads of Navy, feel the same way. We look at this and go, Topshee has inherited the legacy of a bunch of decisions. And I think every one of us who went before him would wish that in hindsight, maybe we could have done things differently. But ultimately, we've all been trying to say the same thing for decades. And fundamentally, what this comes down to is a couple of things that have created this crisis that we're now seeing. And it's not just confined to the Navy.
No, it isn't. And he made that point. The Air Force and Army are confronted with the same issues.
What we're dealing with is decades of what I would characterize and have done publicly as risk management decision making. And when at the time it sounds really, business savvy to make these decisions, but ultimately what this has meant is that we have put cuts or restrictions on spending, and we packaged them as being sensible and in the best interest of a greater good. And whatever the greater good was of the day, typically it was about spending cuts and problems associated with the fiscal framework, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, the impact of all of these decisions, it compounds, and ultimately you end up in a situation like we are, where we have old equipment that is increasingly difficult to maintain for a variety of reasons. We have people who are dealing with an endless list of problems, which are similar to the problems that many Canadians are dealing with, but they're compounded by extra challenges in terms of military service. They're becoming increasingly disgruntled because they're dealing with old equipment that's hard to maintain. They genuinely believe in a mission in support of Canada and our interests and values that isn't being celebrated or embraced by their own government, let alone the people of Canada. And so they're looking at this and they're making decisions. They and their families are saying, look, this is just, I need to go somewhere else. So all these problems are now compounding where we're thousands of people short. We old equipment that's hard, if not impossible, to maintain for a variety of reasons. And let's layer on top of that the absolutely inefficient and arguably ridiculous procurement process that is a recurring problem in this country and has been for decades. So it's a perfect storm. It's a perfect storm.
It is a perfect storm. So the recruiting is down and the bad equipment and the old equipment. I mean, we watch it even trying to send equipment to Latvia or to help the Ukrainians. And you send one tank over and you got to send 4 for spare parts. And, it's It's a crazy situation. What do you think? And I want to come back to procurement specifically, but on the one hand, we have the finance minister talking about 15% cut across the board. We've got to cut everything. Then we have the new defense minister coming out and saying, oh, we need to buy some of this and we need to buy some of this. So which is it? And then when you get all of, whether it's boats or planes or trains, into the middle of the procurement system, it just doesn't seem to work. We can't get to that new piece of equipment.
Yeah, you're hitting several nails on the head there, and it's a complicated interconnecting system of systems, and I'm not going to try and unpack it all today, but let me just address how you laid out that question, because I think you're onto something. First of all, as it relates to budgeting, funding, the fiscal framework, and the strategic pressures that Canada is trying to manage. Look, ultimately, governments get to decide how they want to prioritize spending. I get that. I respect that, and that's life in a democracy. So, but here's the problem: defense is not a cyclical activity. This is a long-term commitment, and it needs to be managed as such. And so you do more damage to the organization by promising increases in budgets or whatever, and then whittling them away on an ongoing, on-demand basis. That is not the way to do it. There is far less flexibility in the $26-ish billion that goes to defense than most people will ever understand. And so when you make a decision, a short-term decision, what ends up happening is it has the impacts that Admiral Topshee is now talking about years later. So the budget cuts that would have been managed in my tenure 10 years ago are the things that are now impacting his ability to lead the institution to deliver what Canadians need today in the mid 2020s. So that's the first comment. You need stable funding, and you can't giveth and taketh away at the same time. Yeah. It's just it has massive ripples through the organization.
Well, let me see if I can just say what I see as a problem there is that, okay, we decide we need a new ship or a new plane, but that's going to take 15 or 20 years to be delivered.
Right.
But the budget, so you're given the money for that, but then you don't spend it all in 1 year because it's delivered over 20, and then if you don't spend it, it's taken back.
Well, yeah, and there's problems, and there's different types of money, and I'm not going to get into that.
Right. But no, I know. But
you're right. But the bottom line is, so let's look at this from buying stuff in general, because this is a part of the problem. You're right. It takes too long, and there's tons of reason why it takes too long, and that's a whole show in and of itself. And I'm not going to get into it. Yeah. But the impacts of it taking too long are what we're seeing. So first of all, you have to keep the old stuff going. Okay. Yeah, and that costs more money, and it becomes increasingly difficult because it's not like you're trying to find parts for a 10-year-old Toyota Corolla. You're trying to find parts for a 30-year-old ship, of which there were only ever 12 built. So that's becoming an increasing problem. Okay. Then you've got the impact on the delays in terms of why it's taking too long, the technology that you're supposed to be delivering, by the time you deliver it, it's already obsolescent or exactly. Yep. And that's a whole set of problems. Plus, and the Auditor General and the Parliamentary Budget Office have both told us this in spades, when you drag out these procurements like we're seeing, the price goes up. Because, Canadians can relate to inflation because they're living it on a day-to-day basis. Defense inflation is 2 to 3 times higher than consumer inflation. So when you drag something out that should only take 10 years and it takes 17 or 18 years, you look at the aggregate effect of what ends up being 10% or plus interest rates. I mean, most of us would love to get that kind of return on our bank accounts.
Yeah.
So this is partly why stuff gets so bloody expensive. And we've got to shorten the timelines. We've got to stop buying things for 30 plus years. We need to be more innovative in terms of how we do this stuff. We need to replace it more rapidly. That drives down the cost of maintaining old, difficult stuff. Everything is expensive. There's no denying it. And anybody to say that it's cheaper, it's misleading. You know, everything is expensive, and Canadians can understand that. But we make things worse by compounding these problems, mostly because of this risk management culture that I referred to earlier. Well, can you guys keep that going for a little bit longer? Oh, we don't want to, that's a lot of money, you know, tens of billions. You know, look at the maritime patrol aircraft issue that's just played out in the last week or so. I mean, celebrating a crisis purchase because we've waited decades longer than we should have to replace something, this is not a best practice. Sure, is it a good decision? You know, well done, but this is not something that should be celebrated, because the decision should have been made ages ago, and we could have been smarter and better, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a long response to your issue, but yeah, we're not helping ourselves.
It gets us to this very point that we started with about our dependence in the back of our mind, and this whole article about the arsenal of democracy. Really, you know, it went back to World War II, that only with the largesse of the Americans did we allow even democracies to flourish. They weren't, you know, that wasn't the majority way to go at that time. But when so we've gotten kind of lazy, and, you know, the Americans will always have our backs, and of course they do on defense questions. But when you do this, if that's part of your risk assessment, which is, oh, we can afford to let this stuff go, or maybe not buy, because of course they'll always be there, is now a very different world when Russia is sitting up at the Arctic and can pierce our airspace at any given moment, when we've got wars on multiple fronts going on, and the Americans are saying we're out of money and our manufacturing sector is not in great shape, and I don't know, maybe we can't provide that arsenal anymore. This is a profound question.
It is, and it goes to the whole issue of alliances, partnerships, the reliability and dependability of your friends in a strategic context, and how, you know, if we look at it in a Canadian context, I mean, fundamentally, three priorities: ensuring the defense of Canada and its interests, which never gets included in the actual statement, sharing the defense of North America, and then, you know, basically doing good things overseas in cooperation with our allies. But it comes down to, you know, we can't even look after our own backyard. So how are we really? And a lot of the stuff that we could use for those two other priorities, we don't even have. You know, like this is why long range patrol aircraft and all these kinds of things are so important. They're not just useful to go off and deal with China if we need to, and we need to think about that as a real possibility. But we need them in order to look after our own domestic interests, and that helps us then be reliable partners with the Americans, et cetera, et cetera. But we can't be a burden on somebody else if we want to be a legitimate and reliable player internationally, and even domestically, in the context of looking after Canadians at home. And, you know, if we need somebody else to help us out, well, then I would give us a big F in whatever that category is. And the issue that you're describing is the fact that the Americans are looking at this themselves and saying, man, we're struggling looking after our own interests, let alone helping out everybody else who's been depending on us for decades. And that's a pretty intimidating wake-up call. The question for us as a country is, well, what are we going to do about it? And are we going to pull up our pants and realize that we have our own responsibilities that we haven't really been addressing? And that the more we do to look after ourselves, the less dependent we will be on the United States, who's looking around and saying, all you folks that are depending on us, man, you really, really need to, sort your own houses out. And I think that's the message that we're not getting.
They're sending us the big wake up calls. Like we're not on the phone when the Five Eyes are meeting or other defense groups, because we're not putting our share into the larger alliances, and it does come at a serious cost. I mean, and also at home, we're asking our military to go and work in old folks' homes and fight fires and fill sandbags when it comes to a flood, all of which they seem to do willingly, and which is good and necessary work, but it's not what they signed up for. And so you've got all those recruiting and maintenance issues there. Like, what's it going to take for us to say, okay, the moment is now? We really have to step up.
Yeah, I can't. I don't know. And I scratch my head as you do.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of things embedded in the first part of that last question. And, the messaging, I think is a huge issue. It's been several years in the making. It's starting to become more punctuated, I guess is the best way to describe it. Yeah. And you're right. The biggest risk for Canada is that we are written off. And some would argue we're already there. I'm not going to get into that kind of hyperbolic discussion, but when that does happen, not sure you can get that back. Now, there's probably a constituency out there would say, yeah, well, so what? Does it really affect us? And it's hard to counter that kind of discussion because you need to pay attention and have more than a 90-second attention span to have the conversation, and B, you need to understand how everything that we do and that we cherish and that we take for granted in this country is connected to something else. We don't live in a bubble. And I think, if anything, the pandemic should have shown us that, not just from the biological sense of the virus, but the sheer interdependencies and interconnectedness of everybody. Anyway, that's that thought.
And the state of our own manufacturing sector, which is the same issue we've got about the US, which is they're just not producing at the same rate, and we all end up dependent on China. And we know what happened during the pandemic with the dependence on China, and I guess we won't know what trouble we're in until the trouble hits.
Well, yeah. Okay. Yeah, you're right, and I'm
just going to give you one last. I know.
No, I'm sighing because I don't like it, but I'm not here to like it. This isn't about liking it, and this is part of the problem is that we restrict the conversation to things that we're comfortable talking about, and this is something that we shouldn't be comfortable talking about. We should be going, okay, let's wake up. Industrial capacity. General Eyre has said for ammunition stocks in Canada are ridiculously low. That's not what he said. I'm paraphrasing. Yeah. We have the capacity to do this, but the industry, which is predominantly in Quebec, but that doesn't matter, that can solve this problem, aren't going to do it out of a sense of benevolence and charity. They need to be paid, and they need to have sustainable orders. This is not, you're not going to just do this for 9 months or 12 months and then shut it down. That's why we have the problems that we have. And, you know, and I'm just using that as an example. And as it relates to the members of the Canadian Forces, look, they'll do whatever is asked of them because that's just the type of people that they are. But ultimately, you have an armed forces that needs to be ready to fight. And this is part of the problem. We don't like talking about this. We're uncomfortable with the notion that ultimately you raise a military in order to defend the country if it's necessary. And I'm not suggesting that anybody's going to invade Canada tomorrow, but to invade or to protect our interests and to go elsewhere and either do good things or do nasty things to bad people. And, you know, if you're not prepared to accept that as the fundamental premise of why you have a national institution, then this is why we get ourselves into the troubles that we're in. And we've lost that. We've lost that understanding. And, you know, a lot of people look at it through the lens of Afghanistan and the sacrifices, and those were legitimate sacrifices that need to be remembered and respected. But ultimately, you know, that was an international commitment to do something. Now, sure, it didn't work out the way we wanted,
Right.
but in hindsight, was doing nothing the right answer? Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
And so, to your point, where's the next problem? And for anybody to assume that there isn't going to be one is naive and irresponsible. And that's where we need to be ready for this kind of stuff, and we're not. And the events of the last week are unfortunately just one more data point in this protracted wake-up call that seems to be lost on many Canadians.
Admiral Norman, thank you. Because we do have to have this conversation. We have to talk about the stuff we're uncomfortable with. And yes, you know, you don't get the peace through strength unless you've got the strength part. and that's what we really have to get to. Vice Admiral Mark Norman, defense strategist at Samuel Associates, Vice Admiral of the Royal Canadian Navy, in which he served for 40 years before becoming the Vice Chief of the Defense Staff of Canada. And we truly always appreciate your insights on this.
Thank you, Senator. And again, thank you for your continued interest in this very important topic. Thanks.
We'll talk again soon. You can count on that. So that is it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wall.